The regimental colors of His Majesty's 3rd Regiment of Foot Guards arrived at Isadora Finn's cottage door on a Tuesday evening in the 2nd week of March, wrapped in oilcloth against the spring rain, and carried by Mr. Pendry, the Duke of Caldermere's head steward, who stood at her threshold with the expression of a man who has rehearsed what he intends to say and discovered, upon arrival, that the words he has prepared are inadequate to the weight of the thing under his arm. Isadora opened the door wide against the cold and held her candle higher to see him properly, and waited. She had known Mr. Pendry since she was 7 years old, in the peripheral way that children know the significant figures of a world that belongs to other people. He had been the man who, 3 years prior, after the death of her father, had come to the cottage with the Dowager Duchess's decision that Isadora was to remain in the estate's archivist cottage at Caldermere Park for as long as she required it. The Duchess had framed it as a temporary arrangement, which was the polite fiction they had both agreed to maintain, and Isadora had been grateful in the specific, clear-eyed way of a woman who understands precisely what she has been given and by whom, and does not confuse gratitude with anything more settled than what it is. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Pendry cleared his throat and told her, in the careful language of a man who has given the matter some preparation, what the bundle contained. The regimental colors of the 3rd Regiment of Foot Guards, returned to Caldermere in October, passed with the regiment's courier, in the condition in which they had been found after the action at Salamanca in the July of the previous year. The colors bore, as she was perhaps aware, the Duke of Caldermere's personal arms incorporated into the regimental design, his family having provided the regiment's original commission under the authority of His Majesty King George II, which commission had been renewed under each subsequent monarch, and most recently at the direct and personal direction of His Royal Highness the Prince Regent himself, who had held the Duke in particular esteem since the matter of the Lisbon dispatches. Which was to say that the colors were not merely a military artifact but a document of royal significance, carrying the cipher of the crown in their border and the Duke's own crest in their center, and the Dowager Duchess would not see them destroyed, and could not in conscience send them to London where the roads from the south were uncertain and the handling unknown. And it was the Dowager Duchess's belief, which was the Dowager Duchess's manner of issuing instructions without appearing to issue instructions, that there was no finer needlewoman in the county than Miss Finn, and was Miss Finn willing. She unwrapped the oilcloth herself. The flag was 4 feet of heavy damask silk in crimson and gold, and it had been beautiful in the way of things made for permanence, made with the intention of outlasting the moment that necessitated them. 2 of the tears were clean cuts, the kind left by something moving very fast through fabric that was not designed to withstand it. The 3rd was ragged and considerable, a 6-inch rupture running directly through the center of the Duke of Caldermere's personal crest, which occupied the central panel of the colors. A silver hawk in full flight, wings fully extended, talons raised, on a field of midnight blue, beneath a crown worked in gold bullion thread, and below that the family motto in silver on black. The hawk's wing was destroyed. The primary feathers were gone entirely, the silk frayed at the edges of the damage in a way that suggested heat as well as force, the specific destruction of a piece of case shot that had passed close enough to burn what it did not tear. And in the lower left corner of the flag, in the quadrant nearest the regiment's royal cipher, there was a stain that Isadora looked at for a long, careful moment before she understood its nature completely, and then she understood it, and did not ask Pendry to clarify. She looked at the flag for some time without speaking. The candles burned. The rain pressed at the small windows of the cottage. Pendry waited with the patient composure of a man accustomed to the decisions of people who think before they speak. Yes, she said, I am willing. She had not always lived a small life. This was not bitterness in the saying of it, simply accuracy. Her father had been a man of genuine learning, employed by the Caldermere estate as its archivist and librarian, a position that had granted him access to one of the finest private collections in the north of England, and had produced in his daughter, who had grown up among those rooms between the catalogued volumes and the careful document boxes, a mind that ran considerably further than the boundaries of the life available to it. She had read property law and parliamentary history by the age of 14. She had read Latin, which was useful, and Greek, which was a private pleasure and served no practical function she had yet discovered. She had read everything her father brought from the lending library in the market town, and had formed opinions about most of it that she kept to herself, because the opinions of a woman in modest circumstances were not generally sought, and she had learned early that opinions shared without invitation were a form of noise rather than a form of speech. She was 26 years old. The county considered this, with the charitable imprecision of people who have never examined their own assumptions, to be an age at which a woman without connections had better have made her peace with what she was not going to have. She had not attended the county's assemblies since her father died, partly because the appropriate dress was beyond her means, and partly because the assemblies required a performance of gentle availability that she found exhausting in exact proportion to its pointlessness. She was not invisible in the county exactly. She was simply not significant in the way that the county valued significance, which required either money or beauty or a family name that had been saying the right things in the right rooms for several generations, and she had none of these things in any quantity that mattered. There was a distinction between invisibility and irrelevance, and she had located herself within it with the pragmatic dignity of someone who has examined the available territory honestly and chosen to make the most of what it offers rather than grieve over what it does not. She earned her living with her needle. The embroidery she had learned from her mother, who had learned it from hers, in a line of female transmission that had apparently considered fine needlework the only accomplishment worth passing on with any real seriousness. She was precise and patient and technically demanding of herself in a way that the county's gentry wives, who hired her for the ornamental work on their household linens and their daughters' trousseau pieces, had come to rely on without entirely understanding. They knew she was excellent. They did not know why, which was that she treated every piece she touched as though it would still be examined in 100 years by someone who knew the difference between work done with full attention and work done adequately, and she could not bring herself to produce the latter when the former was available to her. Caldermere Park had not been quite itself since the Duke left for the continent. This was not something said openly, because the things most obviously true are often the things most carefully left unspoken, but it was felt in the estate's particular quality of suspended arrangement, in the way the house was maintained with complete efficiency and yet seemed to be waiting for something to return to it that efficiency alone could not supply. The Dowager Duchess kept it all running with the iron composure of a woman who has never in her life permitted difficulty to show on her face, and the county continued its rounds, and the stewards managed, and the tenants were dealt with, and on the surface nothing was significantly different from what it had always been. And yet, the Duke of Caldermere was not a man who announced himself. He had no theatrical quality to his authority, which was precisely what made it felt the moment he was in a room and absent the moment he was not. He was 33 and had been the 7th Duke since his father's death 4 years prior, and he had taken up those responsibilities with the focused, unhurried competence of someone who had been preparing for them since childhood and had no intention of doing them inadequately now that they had arrived. He sat in Parliament when not on campaign and was listened to not because he spoke with eloquence, which he did not particularly pursue, but because he was not a man who spoke unless he had something to say, and the room had learned this and attended accordingly. He managed 3 estates across 3 counties with a directness that made his agents trust him and his tenants understand, without being told, that the deal offered to them was the deal they would receive. He was not warm in the way of men who make warmth a performance, but he was fair in the way that is harder to achieve and more valuable in practice, and the people who worked for him understood the distinction. His relationship to the crown was the older, less comfortable kind of loyalty that does not require occasion to demonstrate itself, because it has been built into the family's bones over too many generations to need performance. The Caldermere crest appeared in the household records of 3 Tudor monarchs. The 7th Duke's grandfather had stood beside George II at Dettingen. His father had served George III in the long, difficult years of the king's decline, and Alaric Vane, the 7th Duke, had carried the crown's private correspondence through Portugal in conditions that the Prince Regent's secretary had described in his report, with the professional understatement of a man trained to reduce drama to its minimum, as requiring considerable personal fortitude. The Royal Commission of the 3rd Regiment of Foot Guards had been renewed personally and warmly, which was a departure from the usual bureaucratic process and meant something, in the unspoken language of those transactions, rather more than it said. The county spoke of him with the proprietary pride of a community that considers its most consequential member a reflection of its own standing. It also spoke, with the increasing frequency of people discussing something they consider nearly settled, of the matter of his marriage, which had been anticipated and deferred for long enough that the deferral had itself become part of the conversation. Lady Philippa Courtland, the Earl of Whitbourne's eldest daughter, was widely understood to be the obvious conclusion to a question that the Duke's age and the Dowager Duchess's visible approval had been steadily answering for 2 years. Lady Philippa was beautiful in the clean, unambiguous way that society found easiest to value, and she was appropriate in every particular that could be named, and the county was simply waiting for the formality of an announcement. Isadora had heard this discussed at the haberdasher's counter and at the lending library, and through the open window of the estate house on a June afternoon, when she had come to return a document and had not been observed standing in the courtyard for a moment before she knocked. She had found it of no particular interest. She had examined this finding to make sure it was honest, and concluded that it was, and had continued her afternoon. She had spoken to the Duke twice in the course of her life. The first time had been 10 years prior, when she was 16 and he was 23, and he had come to the library on an estate matter requiring a specific land survey document that her father's failing eyesight had not been quick to locate, and she had found it in the archive in perhaps 3 minutes. And he had said, "Thank you, miss," with the directness of a man who addresses people rather than categories of people, and had left, and that had been the extent of it. The second time had been 2 summers ago, at the Dowager Duchess's garden party. The garden parties at Caldermere Park were a county institution in the way of events that are nominally optional and practically compulsory, and Isadora attended in her second-best dress, and with the composed exterior she had learned to maintain at events where she was simultaneously present and beneath the notice of most of those present, which suited her well enough since it left her at liberty to look at the things that interested her without the obligation to perform interest in things that did not. She had found her way to the rose garden on the south terrace, where the climbing roses that the second Duchess of Caldermere had planted in 1763 were in the full excess of a June bloom that 60 years of committed growing had made extraordinary. She had stood looking at them and thinking about the 1763 garden records her father had catalogued, and had been entirely content in her own company for the better part of 20 minutes before she became aware that someone had come to stand beside her. He was taller than the room of her memory had made him. He was wearing riding clothes, which was wrong for his mother's garden party, which told her he had come straight from somewhere else, and had been redirected here by some force he had not fully resisted. He looked at the roses. He looked at her. He had the quality of stillness she would come to associate with him over the following 2 years of thinking about him more than was reasonable. Not the stillness of a passive man, but the stillness of a man who has spent long enough having his responses observed that he has learned to make his responses considered, and whose consideration has over time become simply the texture of his presence in a room. "You prefer those," he said, the smallest inclination of his head toward the climbing roses, to those. The standard roses along the path, pruned to their formal spheres. She had considered the question with the seriousness it appeared to be offered in. "Yes," she said. "The climbers choose the wall. They commit to it entirely and grow toward it year after year with their whole existence and no apparent intention of reconsidering. The standards are beautiful, but they simply perform in the place they have been assigned." She had paused, because the thought had a second half that she had not initially planned to offer. "I find the climbers more interesting." He had looked at the roses for a moment with the expression of a man receiving information he had not requested and finding it, unexpectedly, more useful than the information he came looking for. "I had not considered it that way," he said. They had talked for perhaps 8 or 10 minutes. She could not now reconstruct the full sequence of what was said, only its quality. The quality of a conversation between 2 people who are both actually thinking rather than performing the act of thinking, which was rarer than it ought to be and more immediately recognizable for its rarity. He had not offered his name. She had not given hers. Neither was necessary, given that both of them knew who the other was, and neither had required the social ceremony of introduction to establish the fact. And then someone had called him away, and he had gone, and the garden party had continued around her, and she had continued looking at the climbing roses, and that had been everything. She had thought about those 10 minutes with an unreasonable frequency for the remainder of that summer. She had told herself clearly that it was unreasonable and had continued regardless, because telling oneself a thing is true is not the same as arranging oneself to feel it, and she had never been able to manage the latter at the instruction of the former. When his regiment was called up in October and the county spent a week discussing the departure, she had said nothing to anyone about 10 minutes in a rose garden, because there was nothing to say, and because the things you do not release are more completely yours than the things you do. She had read every report from the continent that the lending library obtained. She had read the accounts of Salamanca with the specific and focused attention of someone searching for a particular name in a particular list and not finding it, and she had been relieved to a degree that she examined and acknowledged and did not share with anyone. And then the March rain had come, and the flag had arrived with it, and she had said yes, and here she was. She began the work the following morning. The first 2 days she spent simply looking at the flag in the best available light, examining the original workmanship with the complete attention of someone who must understand a thing entirely before they can restore it. The original embroidery had been done by a London professional working in a technique she recognized, but did not use habitually, an interlocking long and short stitch executed at a density that produced a surface almost indistinguishable from woven silk. She would have to match it not in approximation but in precise fact, because the restored sections would sit against the original, and the difference between them would be visible to any eye that knew what to look for. She wrote to the haberdasher in Chester, specifying the thread she required with a precision that went to 4 descriptors per shade. Silver thread in 6 gradations from cold white gray to the warmer silver of aged work. Midnight blue so saturated it was nearly black. Black silk in a weight fractionally heavier than standard, because the original thread for the motto was a type no longer sourced from the same supplier, and she would have to approximate it through weight rather than origin. The threads arrived in 10 days. She spent an afternoon sorting them in the afternoon light from the kitchen window, holding each against the original, moving them back and forth across the boundary where new would meet old, until she had found the closest match available and acknowledged that closest available was the territory she was working in, and that it was sufficient. The hawk's wing took 3 weeks. She worked mornings and evenings, by the best candle she allowed herself, which was her one extravagance in a life she otherwise kept carefully austere, and she worked with the full attention that this kind of work required and that she was capable of giving, which was the complete kind, the kind that does not reserve part of itself for other concerns, but gives the task everything it has and trusts that the rest of life will manage without supervision for the hours involved. She kept notes on each section as she completed it, a habit from her father, who had believed that honest archival work documented its own decisions so that anyone coming after could understand and, if necessary, revise them. She thought about him while she worked. The flag was not him. The crest was not him. The restoration was a professional task undertaken at the request of the Dowager Duchess, and the personal history of the man whose family had borne the crest for 6 generations was, technically speaking, irrelevant to the needle in her hand. She told herself this and believed it in the part of her mind that managed technical beliefs, and continued thinking about him regardless in the part of her mind that was older and less amenable to management. She thought about the ridge at Salamanca. For hours, 37 men lost. The colors carried for the full duration because the colors were what the men who needed something to look at looked at, and someone had made the decision to keep carrying that flag through everything the afternoon had been, and had kept it visible. And the weight of that decision was in the silk under her hands in a way she could not have explained and did not attempt to. The motto took a different quality of attention. The bloodstained corner she had cleaned as carefully as she knew how, and what remained was a lightening rather than a removal, a ghost of what had been there that seemed to her the right outcome, because a complete erasure would have been a different kind of falsification, and she was not in the business of falsification. She reinforced the thread where the cleaning had weakened it, 1 strand at a time, and it was during this slow, careful work that she read the motto fully for the first time and translated it. Tenio quot meum est. I hold what is mine. She held the needle above the cloth and sat with those words for a moment that lasted longer than she had intended. The candle made its small, patient sound. The March wind found the window frame. She thought about a man on a ridge in July with a torn flag in his hands and that motto beneath the hawk's broken wing, and felt something in the vicinity of her sternum that she was not going to examine until she had finished the work and had time to examine it honestly. She resumed. She reinforced the last letters and smoothed them flat with the tip of her smallest bone folder and did not look at the motto again that evening. She finished on a Wednesday morning in October, 7 months after Pendry had brought the oilcloth bundle through her door in the rain. She spread the flag across the table in the full October light, that low, honest, autumnal light that presents things precisely as they are without the softening the summer brings to them, and looked at what she had done. The hawk was whole. The wing was restored to a standard that satisfied her, which was the highest standard she applied to anything. The motto was clear and uncompromising beneath the silver hawk, every letter precisely itself. She ran her thumb along the new border stitching she had added in the final week, when she had understood that the original border throughout had been weakening and required attention that went beyond the original brief, and felt the stitches lie flat and strong, and knew that the work was finished. She wrapped it in clean linen. She wrote Pendry a note that documented every decision she had made, which thread was used and sourced from where, which sections were original and which were new, the technical choices at each point where the damage had required interpretation. She signed it with her initial, as she always did with professional correspondence. She did not charge for the work. This seemed to her simply the accurate response to what the work had been. Some things exist outside the ordinary system of exchange, and the attempt to put a price on them misses the nature of what they are. She walked home across the October Park and thought about nothing in particular, and permitted herself, briefly and without ceremony, the quiet satisfaction of work completed to the fullest extent of her ability. She did not think about the Duke. The work was done. The flag was on its way back to the place it belonged. There was no reason to think about him. She managed this, more or less, for 3 weeks. On the first morning of November, she was in her kitchen garden tying the last of the autumn herbs against the approaching cold when she heard the carriage on the Caldermere Drive. She knew the sounds of that drive as she knew the sounds of her own breathing, unconsciously, precisely, with the accuracy that comes not from attention but from long familiarity. She knew the Dowager Duchess's carriage. She knew the physician's gig. She had not heard this particular sound in more than 2 years. A traveling carriage, well-sprung, moving at the unhurried pace of something that has arrived at the place it belongs and requires no performance of the fact. She stood very still in the garden with the herb string in her hands and listened until the sound of carriage wheels had passed through the park and faded into the distance and the trees. Then she looked down at the herbs and resumed what she had been doing. Her hands were perfectly steady. That evening she sat with her book in the chair beside the fire and read the same page 3 times and comprehended nothing of it. And then she set the book face down on her knee and looked at the fire, and the November dark pressed its cold weight against the cottage windows, and she sat in the specific quality of waiting that belongs to a person who will not admit, even to themselves in private, what it is they are waiting for. The knock at the door came at 7:30. She opened the door expecting Pendry, or perhaps one of the estate footmen with a message from the house, which was how communication from Caldermere Park generally reached the archivist's cottage when it needed to reach it. She had not, in the full catalogue of things she had been sitting with for the past hour, thought to include the Duke of Caldermere himself. He was standing at her door in a dark coat and no hat, which was the kind of detail that told her he had left the house without the full intention of going anywhere specific and had ended up here by a route he had perhaps not designed from the beginning. The November dark was behind him, and the candlelight was in front of him, and she could see the face she had been carrying in her memory for 2 years return to her now at its full and actual scale, which was, as she had suspected, rather larger than memory had managed to maintain. He had changed, not in the fundamental way of men who come back from wars having lost something they cannot name, but in the way a wall changes when it has borne considerable weather. The structure identical, the materials the same, but the surface carrying the record of what has passed over it, and the record not a diminishment, but a kind of completing. He held the left shoulder at the very smallest angle of accommodation, a 1/4 inch of adjustment in the set of it that told her the wound was healed and had left something behind nonetheless. "Miss Fenn," he said. His voice was as she had kept it, low, unhurried, carrying easily through the cold air without apparent effort. "I apologize for the hour." She had approximately 2 seconds in which to decide what her face was going to do, and she used them. She said, "Your Grace," with the composure of a woman who has had sufficient practice at receiving unexpected things that the composure functions even when the situation would more honestly warrant a different response. "Please come in." He came in. The cottage was small, and there was no way to make it feel otherwise with a man of his dimensions standing in the middle of it. But she had arranged it over 3 years with the practical intelligence of someone who understands that a small space honestly organized is more dignified than a small space pretending to be something else. He looked at it with the complete attention he appeared to bring to most things, not taking inventory, simply seeing it, the way she had noticed 2 years ago in a rose garden that he looked at things in order to understand them rather than simply to have looked. He was standing near the work table. He was looking at the table, which was bare now, the flag long returned, but which had been the surface on which 7 months of careful work had been done, and on which a certain quality of attention had been concentrated for that length of time, and which perhaps showed it in some way she could not herself see from the inside. Or perhaps he was simply looking at the nearest thing and gathering himself, which was what she was learning it meant when he went still in a new room. "I have seen what you did," he said. She waited. He looked at her. The candlelight was not generous, but it was honest, and in that honesty she could see something in his expression she had not prepared herself for, which was that it was considerably less contained than she had ever observed it to be. Not that the containment was absent. It was that something underneath it was closer to the surface than she imagined he generally permitted, the way something underground makes itself known not by breaking through, but by the particular quality of the ground above it. The way it changes in texture and temperature to a careful observer, which was the kind of observer she had been of everything in her vicinity for a very long time. "I asked Pendry for the full account," he said, "which thread was sourced from where, and what technique was employed, and how long the work required, and whether you had worked from similar materials before. He gave me your documentation. I read it twice." He paused. "The Hawk's Wing alone required 3 weeks. "Yes," she said. "You went beyond what was asked." She had reinforced the entire border, which had not been requested. She had extended the cleaning treatment beyond the central damage. She said the work required it. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she was beginning to recognize as the one he wore when he was assessing whether the most accurate response to something was also the most useful one, and had not yet concluded which it was. "Pendry tells me you refused payment." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment that had a specific weight to it, the weight of a man standing at the edge of several different things he might say, considering them, discarding the ones that fell short of what he actually meant. "The flag," he said at last, "was carried on the ridge at Salamanca for 4 hours. By the time the action was over it was in the state in which he received it. It had not occurred to me, in the months between Salamanca and returning here, that anything could be done with it beyond preserving it as it was." He paused. "What you did was return it to the condition in which it can be carried again." She understood that this was not simply a remark about the quality of the needlework. "I translated the motto," she said. He went still in the particular way of someone who has been waiting for a thing to be said, and has now heard it said, and is deciding what to do with the arrival of it. "Did you?" he said quietly. "Tinio quat miam est." A long pause. The fire shifted. The cottage held the particular stillness of a small space in which two people are paying very close attention to something that is not being said. "What did you think?" he said, "when you translated it?" She considered this with the seriousness it deserved rather than the first available answer, because he was asking in the way of a man who wants the actual answer rather than the answer that the situation is supposed to produce. "I thought," she said, "that it was either a very simple thing or a very complicated one, depending on what a man understood as his." The fire made its sound. He looked at her with the full, undeflected attention she was learning to receive, which was different from the performed attention of social interaction in the way that a load-bearing wall is different from a decorative partition, and she felt it land, as it always landed, with the weight of something real. He left at 9. He thanked her in the formal language of a duke addressing someone to whom a genuine debt is owed, and she received it in the composed language of a woman who is perfectly capable of receiving what is due without diminishing it. And he walked back across the dark park toward the lights of Caldermere Park, and she closed the door and stood with her back against it and looked at nothing in particular for a time that she did not measure. He came back 2 days later in the afternoon, with Pendry, to review the archive documents her father had catalogued in the cottage's spare room. She showed Pendry to the room and left him to his work, and when she returned to the kitchen, she found the Duke standing at the window looking at the November park with the expression of a man who has been conducting a specific internal conversation for some time and has not entirely resolved it. "The surveys your father organized," he said without preamble, "extend back to the 1680s. "Yes," she said. "He reorganized the filing system in his last years when his eyes were still reliable enough for close work. His indexing is in the front of the first box." The Duke turned from the window. "You know the collection. I grew up in it." He nodded, with the brief, specific nod of a man receiving information he intends to use. "Would you be willing to act as my guide to it when questions arise requiring the archive? It would save considerable time against having Pendry attempt to interpret your father's system without assistance." She was quiet for a moment. "That seems a reasonable arrangement," she said. He was quiet for a moment that matched hers in length. "Yes," he said. "It does." It was not, she understood, entirely about the archive. She understood this with the particular clarity of a woman who has spent years accurately reading the situations available to her. Because in a small life, accuracy is the most valuable tool, and she had sharpened it against everything the county had offered to sharpen it against. She understood it and said nothing about it and did not run from it. And those three responses were the ones she was most privately certain of in the days that followed. He came to the archive 3 times in November. Pendry was present for 2. On the 3rd, he was not, and no explanation was offered for the absence, and she did not ask for one. They were in the small room with the document boxes, the November light doing its low and honest work through the east window, making the room feel simultaneously smaller and more precise than it usually did, everything shadow and specific illumination. He was reading a survey from 1724. She was at the small table her father had used for close work, reading the index by which he had asked her to locate an adjacent document, and there was for some time no sound except the movement of paper and the settling of the old house in the cold. She was not accustomed to silence shared with another person that was comfortable. She was accustomed to the silence of a person living alone, which is a different thing entirely, or to the silence that is the social product of a conversation exhausted of what it had to say, or to silence as the specific texture of avoidance. This was none of those. It was the silence of 2 people who do not feel the requirement to fill the space between them with noise, and who had arrived at this understanding without discussing it, which was itself a kind of discussion. He set down the survey. "Your father," he said, "has a note in the margin of this document in a hand I cannot fully read." She rose and came to look. He remained where he was, which meant they were standing rather closer together than the ordinary occasion of reading a document margin required, and she was aware of this with the specific and unhelpful precision she was coming to associate with his proximity. She read the note aloud and straightened, and took a step back to restore the distance appropriate to professional consultation, and he nodded without comment, and she returned to her chair, and the silence resumed, and she looked at the index without reading it for approximately 2 minutes before the words began to register again. Lady Philippa Courtland arrived at Caldermere Park on the 15th of November. She came with her mother, the Countess of Whitbourne, in a traveling carriage that the county noted passing through the market town with the specific attention given to things that are expected and therefore watched for. The Dowager Duchess had issued the invitation 4 weeks prior, which was sufficient notice to convey seriousness without conveying urgency, which was precisely the register the Dowager Duchess intended. The visit was for 10 days. The household at the park was arranged with the specific care that attended the presence of a family from whose ranks the next duchess might be drawn, and the county understood the arrangement and discussed it accordingly. Isadora heard about the arrival from the Daily Woman, who had it from the estate's laundry woman, who had it from Mrs. Alderton, which was the route by which information reliably traveled from the park to the archivist's cottage, taking approximately half a day to make the journey and acquiring considerable elaboration along the way. She received it as a fact relevant to her situation and requiring no particular response. She thought about it afterward with the clear-eyed pragmatism she applied to everything that required it, and arrived at the conclusion she had already known, which was that the situation had a natural shape to it that existed independently of anything that had passed in the small room with the document boxes, and that she would do well to remember this. She thought about the motto. She thought about the 10 minutes in the Rose Garden 2 years ago and the quality of the November conversations, and she thought about the distinction between a thing that has the character of something real and a thing that has merely the character of something significant, and found that this was a distinction she could not yet draw with confidence, and that the inability was itself the most honest piece of information available to her. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It was on the 2nd day of Lady Philippa's visit that the Dowager Duchess sent word to the archivist's cottage. Miss Finn was invited to dine at Caldermere Park on the evening of the 17th, along with the estate families and several county families, in a gathering the invitation described as informal. In the Dowager Duchess's vocabulary, informal covered a considerable range of occasions, none of which were without structure. There was no comfortable way to decline. Isadora knew this and did not try. She wrote a brief reply of acceptance and dressed with more care than usual and told herself this was simply the appropriate effort for a dinner at the park, which was true, and was also not the whole truth, which she acknowledged and did not pursue. The dining room held 20 that evening, the county families who attended the Dowager Duchess's occasions by long-standing habit, the Whitbourne ladies, the estate physician and his wife, the vicar, 2 younger men who were visiting acquaintances of the Duke's from his military service, and Isadora, who arrived alone and was seated at the far end of the table from Lady Philippa and her mother, among the estate families rather than among the guests of principal consequence. She had expected this and had no quarrel with it. It was the accurate arrangement. She sat between the physician's wife, a comfortable woman of 50 with whom she had always gotten along easily, and one of the Duke's military acquaintances, a Captain Eames from Derbyshire, who had the quality of unself-conscious warmth she found immediately easy to talk to, and who asked her, within the first 10 minutes, what she thought about the withdrawal from Burgos, which was an unusual question to ask a woman at a county dinner, and she told him, and he listened with genuine interest, and they had the best conversation of the evening, and she was aware throughout it that she was not looking at the head of the table and that this required a small and continuous effort. She looked at the head of the table twice. The first time was when she heard him laugh, which she had not heard before, a low and brief and genuine sound, the laugh of a man for whom laughter is specific rather than social, produced by something one of the older estate families had said rather than by anything he had said himself, which told her something that confirmed what she had already suspected. The second time was when she felt, in the way that operates independently of any reasonable physical explanation, that he was looking at her. She looked. He was. He held her gaze for perhaps 2 seconds, which was 1 second longer than the accident of two people glancing in the same direction at the same moment could account for. And then he looked back to his left, to Lady Philippa, who was saying something with the animated grace of a young woman trained since childhood to be precisely as charming as the occasion requires, and who achieved this with a completeness that left nothing to be desired and nothing to distinguish one room from another. Isadora looked back at Captain Eames and resumed her argument about the Burgos withdrawal, and the dinner continued. Afterward, in the drawing room, the women assembled on one side with the automatic organization that social convention produced, like a magnet and its filings, and she stood near the window with her tea and looked at the November dark beyond the glass and waited for the remaining portion of the evening to elapse. The Dowager Duchess came to stand beside her. She was a woman of 60, tall and silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome in its youth and had become, with age and the character that animates it, considerably more interesting than either handsome or beautiful. She stood beside Isadora at the window and looked at the garden the dark had made invisible, and said, "My son speaks of you." She said it without inflection, without the rising note of a woman making an observation that requires a response, simply as a fact offered for what it was. Isadora received it the same way. "The archive has been useful to him," she said. "My father organized it with exceptional care." The Duchess looked at her for a moment with the clear, unsparing assessment of a woman who has spent 60 years reading situations accurately. "Yes," she said. She set her cup down on the windowsill with a precision that was its own kind of statement. "You are a woman of considerable quality, Miss Fenn. I have always thought so, and I want you to understand that my saying so is not an insignificant thing." A pause. It is also not a simple one. Then she moved away to join Lady Whitbourne, and Isadora stood at the window with her cooling tea and understood that she had been warned, and that the warning had been offered with more genuine respect than most warnings carry, and that neither of these facts changed what it was. She was the last of the estate families to leave. The physician's wife was her nearest neighbor, and by the time the evening concluded that lady was engaged in a conversation with Lady Whitbourne that showed no particular signs of natural resolution. Isadora was in the entrance hall with her cloak on and her gloves in her hands when she heard his step on the staircase behind her. She turned. He had come from the upper floor. He was in the entrance hall in 2 minutes that could not, by any arrangement of the evening's remaining guests and footmen, be described as accidental, and she was beginning to understand that his arrivals that had the appearance of the accidental all had a consistent shape to them, which was that they tended to produce, through apparently unconnected routes, the same result. "You are leaving," he said, a statement rather than a question, and underneath it something she had learned to hear in him. The thing beneath the statement that the statement was there to manage. "The physician's wife is my nearest neighbor," she said. "I am waiting for her." He came down the remaining stairs with the slight accommodation in the left shoulder that she had been quietly tracking since the first night, and crossed the entrance hall, and stood at the precise distance of a man who is not intruding into your space, but who has placed himself at the very edge of his own, which is a different thing and requires, on both sides, a different quality of attention. "Are you well?" he said. It was not a social question. It was the question of someone who wants the actual answer. "I am well," she said, and then, because he had asked in a way that deserved honesty. I found the evening more demanding than usual. He was quiet for a moment. The entrance hall had 2 footmen at its far end near the main doors, and the distant warmth and noise of the drawing room beyond, and the particular quality of a space that is simultaneously public and without immediate witness. I noticed, he said, that you were not looked at in the way that you should be in this house this evening. She looked at him. The candlelight in the entrance hall was warm and generous, considerably more than the cottage candle, and she could see his face with the completeness that it deserved, and that she had been allowing herself in careful portions, the way you allow yourself something you know you cannot afford in large quantities. Your Grace, she said, I was looked at precisely as my situation warrants. That, he said, and she heard in it the very first place where what was beneath the composure was closer to the outside than he had previously permitted, the very first crack in the surface of the thing he carried so carefully. That is the precise thing I find myself unable to agree with. The physician's wife appeared at the drawing room door and spoke her name. She turned and put on her gloves and said good evening to the Duke of Caldermere with the composed courtesy of a woman who is in full control of her own face, even when maintaining that control is the hardest thing available to her, and she walked out into the November night and did not look back. She walked home across the park beside the physician's wife, who talked about the dinner with the pleasant, undemanding warmth of a woman for whom an evening at the park is a thoroughly satisfying occasion requiring no further examination, and Isadora answered appropriately and was not present in any part of herself that mattered. And the cottage lights came through the bare winter trees, and she was glad of them in the specific way of someone grateful for the small, reliable warmth of a thing that is entirely their own. Inside, with the door closed, she sat in her chair and looked at the fire and held the evening in her mind without trying to arrange it into something other than what it was. He had said, that is the precise thing I find myself unable to agree with. He had not said it with the easy warmth of a man distributing compliments. He had said it with the flat, reluctant honesty of a man admitting something he would have preferred, by temperament and by every measure available to him, not to admit, in a voice that was almost entirely level and was not entirely level. And the small difference between those two things was the most significant thing she had heard in 2 years of paying careful attention to the world around her. She did not sleep well. She sat with the fire until it was low and then went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about the Dowager Duchess at the window with her tea in both hands and her careful, genuine warning, and about Lady Philippa in the drawing room with her animated grace and her appropriate loveliness, and about the shape of a situation that has a natural conclusion already formed within it, independent of everything that has passed in a small archive room or a cottage beside a dying candle. And she thought about the motto, and about the climbers on the wall, and about the specific courage of things that do not reconsider the direction they have committed to, and she told herself, in the most honest language available to her, that she was a woman of 26 in a cottage on an estate that had housed her through the grace of other people, with nothing to offer a man of his position that his position had not already provided itself, and that the most courageous thing she could do, with what had been building in her since the Hawk's Wing was restored, was to hold it exactly where it was, entirely her own, entirely private, and entirely without consequence for anyone else. This was the right decision. She was nearly certain it was the right decision. It was on the 20th of November, 3 days after the dinner, that he came to the cottage alone, in the afternoon, without Pendry and without a stated reason, and knocked. She opened the door with the composure she had been rebuilding for 3 days, and said, Your Grace, and he said, Miss Fenn, and then he said, I have been thinking about something you said, which was how he began most of his genuine conversations with her, as though the conversation had been running in him between visits, and he was returning to it rather than beginning it. She let him in. She did not offer tea. She sat in one chair and he sat in the other, beside the fire, which was the arrangement of 2 people in a small room who have arrived at something closer to honesty than propriety quite covers. And he looked at the fire, and she looked at the fire, and there was the silence she had learned to receive from him as its own kind of speech. You said, he began, that you found the motto either very simple or very complicated, depending on what a man understood as his. Yes, she said. I have been considering what you meant. I meant what I said. You meant, he said, with the care of a man who has been working at a thing for several days and has arrived at his conclusion and intends to deliver it precisely, that the motto's meaning depends entirely on the scale at which a man applies it, whether he applies it to the estate and the title and the obligations of his position. He paused. or whether he applies it more broadly. She was looking at the fire. I meant that a man who reads that motto and understands it to refer to his estate is reading it correctly, and a man who reads it and understands it might refer to something else entirely is also reading it correctly. She paused. And that the difference between those two readings is the difference between a man who has inherited his values and a man who has chosen them. The November afternoon had gone entirely to dark by 4 o'clock now, pressing at the cottage windows with its cold weight. He sat in the chair with his hands open on the arms of it, which was the most unguarded posture she had seen him occupy. Hands open and still, the usual contained quality of him loosened slightly by something she thought was close to the particular tiredness of a man who has been careful for a very long time and has decided, in this room, in this hour, to be slightly less so. I am expected, he said, to make a decision. Yes, she said. It is the right decision by every measure I have been taught to apply. Yes, she said again. He was quiet for a long moment. The candle on the table was burning low. She would need to replace it, and did not move to do so, because the movement would disturb something in the room she was not ready to disturb. I find, he said finally, in a voice so level it was nearly flat, that I am less able to apply those measures than I expected to be, and that the difficulty is not recent. She turned and looked at him directly, which she had not been doing, because looking at him directly had become something she permitted herself in portions, and she was rationing this portion. He was looking at the fire. His jaw was set in the way it set when he was keeping something at a distance that was making its way toward him regardless. She could see the shoulder's small accommodation in the way he held the arm of the chair, and the particular quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a man who has chosen to remain still instead of doing the thing his whole character was inclining him toward. The difficulty, she said carefully, has a name. He turned and looked at her. In the low candlelight his eyes were dark and direct, and without the management she had seen them employ in every other context. And for a single unhurried moment, she was simply looking at him, and he was simply looking at her, with nothing between that moment and everything that had been accumulating since the March evening the flag arrived, held in the small warm air of the cottage like a third presence between them, patient, and entirely unwilling to be argued into something more manageable, by the force of what was prudent and what was expected, and what the situation's natural shape required. Yes, he said. It has a name. He left before the candle went out entirely. He said good evening with the formal courtesy of a man who has not forgotten who he is, and she received it with the composed courtesy of a woman who has not forgotten who she is, and the door closed between them, and she sat with the dying candle and the fire and the full weight of what had been said and what had not been said and the terrifying clean clarity of an evening that had moved several things from the category of possible to the category of real. She was still sitting there when the candle gave out, and she sat a little longer in the dark and the firelight, and thought about the hawk with its whole wing, and the wall that the climbers had chosen, and the particular courage of things that do not reconsider the thing they have committed to. On the morning of the 22nd of November, Mrs. Alderton, the Caldermere Park housekeeper, appeared at the archivist's cottage door with a note. Not from the Duke. From the Dowager Duchess. It requested Miss Finn's company for tea that afternoon at 3 o'clock in the small sitting room on the east side of the park. It was not a request that could be declined, and Isadora did not try. She wrote a brief reply of acceptance and dressed carefully and walked across the cold park at 2:45 with the composure of a woman going to a conversation she has already prepared herself for, because she had understood since the evening at the window that this conversation was coming, and had spent the intervening days being as honest with herself as she could manage about what she intended to say when it arrived. The small sitting room was exactly as its name suggested, a room arranged for exactly this kind of exchange, intimate without being informal, comfortable without inviting the comfort of ease. A fire, a tea service, 2 chairs positioned with the deliberateness of things placed by someone who understood that the physical arrangement of a conversation shapes its character. The Dowager Duchess poured tea herself, her way of conducting conversation she did not wish to have witnessed, and said nothing while she did it, and handed Isadora her cup with the small, precise courtesy of a woman for whom the gestures of ordinary life are never too small to be done correctly. My son, she said, setting down the teapot with the measured movement that announced a subject, is not a man who does things without intention. Isadora said, No, I have observed that. His visits to the archive. The Duchess looked at her directly. I am aware of the visits. The archive is his, Isadora said. The The visits are entirely within his rights. Yes, a pause, as is everything else he might choose to do, which is precisely the matter I wish to speak to you about. She held her cup with both hands, and there it was again, the gesture Isadora had noticed at the dinner table window, the small, unconscious revelation of a woman holding something heavier than a teacup. He is a man who has returned from a war that did something to him I do not yet fully understand, and who is, in some part of the difficulty he currently finds himself in, not the man who left, and who is making decisions, or failing to make them, for reasons I cannot fully account for. She paused. I say this not to diminish the regard I believe he holds for you, Miss Fenn. I say it because I am his mother and I know him, and what I know leads me to ask something of you that I have no right to ask. The fire made its sound. Isadora sat with her tea and met the Duchess's eyes and waited. I am asking you, the Duchess said, to consider the full consequences of what is forming between you, and to consider them honestly, and to tell me whether you believe, in the honest part of yourself, that you are willing to bear them. It was not the warning she had expected. She had expected the other kind, the kind dressed as concern for Isadora's well-being that was in fact concern for the Caldermere succession and the social architecture that had been carefully maintained for 6 generations. This was something else entirely. This was a woman asking a different question, and the difference did something to Isadora's chest that she had been keeping firmly in place and had not fully expected to give way. She set her cup down. She thought for a moment that was not evasion but genuine consideration, the kind that goes to the actual center of the thing rather than to its manageable edges. I am willing, she said, to be honest about the full consequences. I am not yet certain I can predict what they are. The Duchess was quiet. Then she said, with the slight, private quality of a woman arriving at a conclusion she had been resisting, no, I find I am not certain of that either. She looked at the fire. He has not looked at anything the way he looks at that flag since he came back. And that tells me something about the 7 months between your hands and his hands holding it that I cannot account for by any ordinary explanation. She rose. Isadora rose. The tea was finished and the conversation was finished, and outside the small sitting room's window the November dark was already pressing at the glass with the patient insistence of a season that intends to complete itself regardless of who is ready for it. At the door, the Duchess paused. Lady Philippa leaves on the 25th, she said. My son has said nothing definitive. She looked at Isadora with the clear, complicated gaze of a woman who has arrived somewhere she did not intend to arrive and is still determining what to do about it. I thought you should know. Isadora walked home across the park in the full dark with her cloak pulled close against the cold and the sound of her own footsteps on the frozen grass, and felt the shape of everything that was forming in her life with the specific, unavoidable clarity of something that can no longer be managed at a distance, but must be walked toward or walked away from, and that the direction chosen in the days ahead would determine, more permanently than she had ever been required to determine anything, what kind of woman she was going to be. She thought about the flag. She thought about the hawk with its wing rebuilt feather by feather in the dark of the cottage evenings. She thought about the motto and the wall and the climbing roses and the specific, uncommon courage of things that do not reconsider the direction they have committed to. And she thought about a man sitting in her chair beside her fire with his hands open and his composure telling the truth for the first time, and about what it had cost him to let it. The cottage came through the bare trees with its small warm light, and she went inside, and she sat in her chair by the fire, and she made her decision. She was at the estate library the following morning, having come to return 2 survey volumes she had taken to the cottage for reference, and she was at the far shelves replacing them when she heard the library door behind her. She did not turn immediately. She heard his steps. She had learned his steps the way you learn the particular sounds of a world you have been living inside, not consciously, but in the part of the mind that registers pattern and weight, and the specific rhythm of a thing you have been paying attention to for long enough that attention has become something closer to knowledge. He came to the shelves. He did not ask what she was doing there, because he knew, and she did not explain, because the explanation was self-evident, and they stood for a moment in the particular quality of a shared space that has become familiar enough to be easy and not so familiar that it has lost its charge. I have been thinking, she said, without turning from the shelves, because it was easier to say what she intended to say without looking at him directly. He waited, which was what he did when he was listening with everything he had. She replaced the second survey volume and turned. You said the difficulty has a name, she said. So does the decision. He looked at her across the library shelves in the November morning light that came through the tall windows at its low and honest angle. His expression was the one she had been learning for 2 months, the one beneath the composure, the one that appeared when he had encountered something he intended to meet honestly rather than manage at a distance. "Yes," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I am not a woman who knows what she is worth to the world," she said. "I have never had sufficient evidence to arrive at that conclusion with confidence. But I know what the work is worth. And I know what it means that you came to my door the same evening you returned from a 2-year war, before you had slept, before you had sat with your mother, before you had done any of the things a man in your position does when he comes home." She paused. "That is the evidence I have. And I have found that it is, against everything I have spent 3 weeks telling myself, sufficient." The library was very still. The November light lay across the floor in its long pale rectangles. Somewhere in the house a clock made its small, steady sound. The sound of a house marking the time in ordinary ways, while something entirely extraordinary occupied the library. He crossed the room. He came to where she was standing and stopped at the distance he always maintained, and then closed half of it, which was not nothing, and looked at her with the full, unhurried, unmanaged attention she had been the recipient of, and the subject of, and the cause of since the night he arrived at her door, and said, with the flatness of his most honest register, "I went to your door first. Before my mother. Before the estate reports. Before anything." He paused. "I had been planning to go to the archive on a stated pretext, and had not managed 200 yards of the walk across the park before I understood that the pretext was not available to me, and that there was only the honest route, or no route at all." She looked at him. "I spent 7 months," she said, "rebuilding the wing of a hawk that belongs to a man I had spoken to for 10 minutes. And I did not charge for the work, and I signed my note with only an initial, and I told myself every evening while I was doing it that what I was doing was a professional service and nothing more." She paused. "I found that telling myself a thing clearly does not reliably produce the thing I am telling myself." Something moved across his expression that was not the composure and was not the management, and was simply for a single, unhurried, genuine moment him, the man who had been on the ridge, who had held the colors for 4 hours, who had come to a cottage door in November dark without a hat, who was standing in his own library at the edge of a distance that was not very large, and that had become, over 2 months, the most significant distance he was aware of occupying. He reached out and took her hand from where it rested at her side. He held it in both of his, the warmth of it immediate and complete, the warmth of a choice made openly and without remainder, and she turned her palm against his fingers and felt the stitches she had put into the hawk's wing in the dark of many evenings lying flat and strong in her memory, and the motto lying clear and certain beneath the silver bird, and understood, with the quiet, unhurried certainty that sometimes arrives not in a moment of great noise, but in a library in the November light, that she had been building toward this for considerably longer than either of them had been counting. "There are," he said, at considerable composure for a man in his position, "several things that will need to be addressed." "Yes," she said, "there are. Beginning with my mother." "Your mother," she said, has already addressed several of them. He looked at her with the not-quite smile that she had learned was one of his rarest things. "Has she?" "Yes." She paused. She asked whether I was willing to bear the consequences. He was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I was willing to be honest about them." "I am telling you the same thing." She looked at him steadily. "I have no way to predict what the county will say, or what it will mean for your position here, or for the other matters that depend on the decision you make. I can only tell you what I told your mother, which is that those are the honest terms and I intend to meet them honestly." He held her hand and looked at her in the November light, and said nothing for a moment that had the quality of a man setting down something he has been carrying for a long time and discovering that the ground beneath it is solid. "I should speak to you properly," he said. "I should do this in the correct order and by the correct means. With your permission, on a different occasion, with considerably more formality than a library on a Tuesday morning." She almost smiled. The particular smile that arrived when something was both serious and slightly absurd simultaneously, which was, she was finding, the register that the most important things often occupied. "You may speak to me however you wish," she said. "I am not in a position to require formality from a man standing in his own library." He looked at her with the expression that had the fullness of everything it was and nothing it was performing. "That," he said quietly, "is going to change." The library clock made its sound. The November light moved in its slow, honest arc across the floor. Outside, The Caldermere grounds held their patient winter silence. The bare trees and the frost-touched grass and the cold sky above the south terrace where climbing roses were waiting, as they had waited for 60 years, for a season worth growing toward. She did not know, standing in the library with her hand held in both of his, what the county would say. She did not know what Lady Philippa's departure on the 25th would mean for the Whitbourne family's expectations, or for the Dowager Duchess's careful plans, or for the architecture of everything the Caldermere name was connected to by obligation and by history. She did not know what a woman of her circumstances becoming the Duchess of Caldermere would look like from the outside, which was to say from every angle except the one she was standing in. What she knew was this, that the Hawk's Wing was whole, that the motto was clear, that she had translated it herself, in the dark, by a candle that was slowly being consumed, and had understood it not as a statement about property or inheritance or the accumulated weight of 6 generations of a family that had served the crown since the Tudors, but as the statement of a man who understood, in some essential and inarguable part of himself, what he held and intended to keep holding, and who had carved that understanding into silver thread on black silk so that it would outlast him, and that she was, despite every reasonable argument she had been constructing against it for 3 weeks, entirely and irrevocably glad that the flag had come to her door in the March rain, and that she had said yes. He spoke to his mother that afternoon. The following week, he spoke to the county, in the quiet, settled manner of a man who has made a decision completely and requires no one's permission to stand behind it. Lady Philippa returned to London. The county spoke, as it always speaks, and then fell quiet, as it always does when a duke makes himself sufficiently clear. In December, they stood on the south terrace together, and inside the great hall behind them the regimental colors hung in the winter light, the hawk hole, the motto certain beneath its silver wing. She had held what was his. He had chosen to hold what was hers. And on the wall, the climbing roses reached on. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.